Hello and welcome back to Ranger in Time Disaster on the Titanic, a book by Kate Mesner. In this video, I'll be reading chapters 4 through 6. Chapter 4, Bound for New York. On the morning of April 2nd, 1912, the Titanic set sail for the English city of Southampton. Patrick stood beside Ranger on the deck as Belfast grew smaller in the distance. "We're off to New York, dog," Patrick said, scratching Ranger behind his ear. "We will be soon, at least. First, we'll go to England and France to pick up passengers, then back to Ireland for one last stop in Queenstown. A little over a week from now, we'll be setting off across the Atlantic." "Murphy," called one of the crewmen, "let's go. There's painting yet to do." Ranger followed Patrick down some stairs and through a long hallway to a propped open door. Inside was a fancy bed, desk, and chairs. It smelled of polished wood and fresh paint. "You'd better wait here," Patrick told Ranger. "They won't want dogs in the first-class cabins." Ranger sat in the hallway. The big ship was full of interesting smells. Salt water and steel and the sweat of all the men still working. Also, cat. Ranger sniffed the air. Definitely cat. He followed this cat smell down the hallway to a storage closet where a mother cat and her new kittens were curled up next to a crate of potatoes. Ranger barked. The cat hissed at him. Patrick appeared in the doorway. "I see you've met Jenny," he said, and reached down to stroke the cat's fur. She purred and leaned into Patrick's hand. "She's our ship's cat." Patrick stood up and patted Ranger's head. "Two. Don't worry," he whispered. "The kittens may be cute, but you're still my favorite." 2 days later, the Titanic arrived in Southampton to a flurry of activity. Ranger kept an eye on Patrick, but mostly he tried to stay out of the way while workers loaded supplies. Then came the passengers, a stream of men and women in dark, fancy clothes. Some of them brought dogs. They were mostly fluffy little things, but one tall man with a mustache bordered with an Airedale he called Kitty. Ranger also saw a wrinkly dog with a scrunched up face. "I picked him up in Paris," the dog's owner told another man. "French bulldogs are popular there." Patrick carried luggage for wealthy first-class passengers who had purchased expensive tickets with fancy rooms and fine dining. He directed third-class people where to go too. Their tickets cost much less, so their cabins were simpler, more crowded, and on the lower decks. The night before they left Southampton, Ranger saw the Jenny cat again. She was carrying her kittens off the ship one by one. It looked like only the dogs would be going to New York. That was fine with Ranger. He didn't like being hissed at anyway. When the Titanic left England, crowds stood in the sunshine waving handkerchiefs to say goodbye. It was 4 hours to Cherbourg, France, where the ship dropped anchor a mile offshore. Cherbourg's pier wasn't big enough for the Titanic, so another boat called the Nomadic had to ferry passengers out to board the big ship. Many of these new passengers spoke different languages. Some had come from villages in Lebanon, another crew member told Patrick. They were going to start new lives in America. At the edge of the crowd, Ranger saw two children who looked a little older than Luke and Sadie. The girl held a small rag doll with black hair like hers. They seemed as if they might be lost. Ranger trotted over and nuzzled the boy's hand. The boy jumped back, but his younger sister knelt and stroked Ranger's fur. Soon Patrick hurried over. "Where's your family?" he asked the children. "They are in America," the boy said in a small voice. "They left us behind until they could find jobs and a place to live." "Oh, are you from one of the villages in Lebanon?" Patrick asked. The girl nodded. "Our uncle taught us English," she said, "to be ready for America. Teta learned too." "Teta?" Patrick looked around. "Our grandmother," the girl said. "But she is sick right now, so we are going to America on our own. She will come later." The girl seemed fine with that, but the brother's face was full of worry. Patrick understood what it was like to feel alone. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll take good care of you on the Titanic." "What are your names?" Miriam, the girl said. I'm 9 and my brother Hamad is 10. I'm Patrick and I'm part of the crew. I also helped build this ship. Patrick couldn't help standing a little taller when he said that. Can you show us where our cabin is? Hamad said, holding out their tickets. Sure, but it'll have to be in a little while, when things quiet down, Patrick said. You're on E deck, and I'm assigned to work up here while people board. The children waited with Patrick as the other passengers boarded. When everyone was finally settled, Patrick said, Let's find your cabin now. All right? Patrick and Ranger led the children down to the Titanic's E deck, 2 floors above the ship's engine and boiler rooms. Hamad and Miriam were in a cabin with a family of 6 people from their village. The man and woman welcomed them. This crowded room looked nothing like the first-class cabins. It was smaller and simpler and filled with noise and activity. The mother was unpacking things she'd brought from home. One of the older brothers began playing a hand drum he held under his arm. A durbaka, Miriam said, and ran over to play with him. Have a good voyage, Patrick said. You too, Miriam called. Hamad waved from his bunk. Patrick walked down a long hall to the cabin he shared with other crew members. Just one more stop before we set off across the Atlantic, dog, Patrick said, yawning. He climbed into his bunk and went to sleep with Ranger curled up at his feet. The next day, when the ship docked in Queenstown, peddlers came on board to sell Irish lace and other last-minute goods. Then finally, the Titanic left Ireland with hundreds of seagulls flying in its wake. We're off to New York, Patrick told Ranger. Ranger sniffed the salty air and leaned in to let Patrick pet him. He'd been away from Luke and Sadie for so long. Maybe now his work was almost done. How far was it to New York? Ranger didn't know, but he hoped that when they arrived, he'd finally get to go home. Chapter 5. Danger on Deck. For the next 2 days, Ranger followed Patrick around the ship as it surged through the waves. The men from the shipyard who had come along on the maiden voyage helped with whatever needed to be done, assisting first-class passengers, peeling potatoes, delivering messages. Whenever he had a moment, Patrick went down to the third-class cabins to visit his new friends, Hamad and Miriam. The people from their village welcomed him and Ranger with figs from their trees back home. Most didn't speak English, but those who did told Patrick how they'd traveled on donkeys to Beirut, sailed from there to Marseille, and then taken a train to Cherbourg to board the big ship. Patrick told them how he had helped build the Titanic back in Belfast, piece by piece, from her propeller to the funnels that towered over the deck. But would you like to know a secret? Patrick said. Only 3 of the 4 funnels are connected to the boilers. The 4th is just for show to make the ship look more powerful. Isn't the ship powerful enough? Hamad asked. She certainly is, Patrick said. There's talk that we could set a new speed record to New York. At the end of each night, Patrick went back to the crew's sleeping quarters. He kept the pouch with his father's 2 shiny pennies under his pillow. How proud his father would be if he could see Patrick now. That's my boy, he'd say, sailing clear across the wide ocean so you can care for your mother when you get home. Ranger curled up at the foot of Patrick's bunk at night and let the hum of the ship lull him to sleep. Even though Ranger didn't usually like boats, this big one was different, strong and steady, and not at all tippy. Still, Ranger dreamed of his dog bed in the mudroom. He dreamed of squirrels and bacon and Luke and Sadie, and when he'd get to go home. On Sunday, April 14th, Patrick was called to help serve dinner in the first-class dining room. There were oysters and poached salmon, duckling and lamb and beef. Dessert was a spread of pudding, ice cream, and eclairs. Ranger wasn't allowed in the dining room, so he climbed the stairs to the top of the ship and wandered the boat deck while Patrick was busy with dinner. One of the little yappy dogs always barked at Ranger, but most of the passengers were happy to see him. The ladies strolling on deck would pause and bend down to pat his head. Miriam, someone shouted, just as Ranger was getting his neck scratched by a lady in a fluffy black hat. Ranger turned and saw Hamad hurrying along the deck with a little rag doll. Miriam, Hamad called, looking around. When he saw Ranger, he ran to him and dropped to his knees. I can't find my sister, he said. Find? Ranger's ears perked up. He sniffed the little doll in Hamad's hands. It smelled of the third-class cabins, like smoke and spices. But there was another smell, too. The Miriam girl. She's wandered off. Can you help me find her? The boy asked. Find? Ranger knew that command from his search and rescue training. He'd always been able to find Luke in their practice sessions. He'd found him hiding in the woods on hot summer days and buried in the snow on winter mornings. He'd practiced finding Luke in wide open meadows and on busy city blocks, but he'd never found anyone on a ship before. Ranger sniffed the air. There were lots of people smells here. First-class men and women were rushing back to their cabins. They smelled of soap and perfume and the greasy meat they'd eaten for supper. Another smell hung over the boat deck, too. Ranger tipped his nose to the dark sky and sniffed the brisk, icy air. It smelled cold and fishy and sharp, but there was no Miriam smell. Ranger led Hamad to the back of the boat and looked down to the deck below, where third-class passengers could walk in the open air at the boat's stern. It was late and the sky was dark. The night air was too cold for stargazing. All the passengers had gone to their cabins. The deck was empty. She's not here. I'm going to find help, Hamad said as he turned and walked away. Just as Ranger was about to follow him, he caught a scent on the wind, but then it was gone. Ranger walked all along the railing. He kept sniffing the cold air, searching for the Miriam smell. Finally, there. Ranger looked down at the empty deck. There were no people, only a big crane that the crew used to move baggage sometimes. Earlier, some of the boys from the third class had been climbing it, shimmying out on its long arm and then dropping down to the deck. They'd raced around, playing and climbing until their fathers made them stop. But the boys were gone now, and Miriam was nowhere to be found. Every time Ranger caught her scent, it disappeared again. The smell was too scattered for him to follow. Where was she? Ranger sniffed the air and barked. Then he heard a high, scared voice. Help! Please! I'm up here! Chapter 6. Climbing High. Ranger looked down. Miriam had climbed out almost to the tip of the crane's arm. She was hugging the metal and looked like she'd been there a while. Her hands were chapped and raw in the cold ocean air. Her face was streaked with tears. I'm stuck, Miriam shouted. She clung to the crane with one arm and tugged at her skirt with the other. The fabric was caught in the machinery. Ranger barked. He couldn't help Miriam. He didn't know how to get down to the deck below. There were no stairs. Even if he jumped, he couldn't climb the big machine and get her down. But he could bring someone who would. Ranger took off running across the deck. He bounded down 3 flights of stairs to the saloon deck, where Patrick had been working. The first-class passengers had all gone to bed, but a few stewards remained cleaning up dessert dishes and straightening chairs. There, Ranger saw Patrick collecting teacups on a big tray. He ran up and barked. Patrick jumped and almost dropped the tray. The cups and saucers rattled and clinked together. What are you doing, dog? Patrick's voice sounded cross. He put the tray down and reached for Ranger's collar. Ranger darted away from him. Patrick followed him. Ranger barked and took a few steps down the hallway. He ran back to Patrick and jumped on him. Then he ran down the hallway again. What is it, dog? Patrick asked. What's wrong? He followed Ranger through the reception area and up the grand staircase. Ranger led Patrick to the back of the ship. This time he caught Miriam's scent in a hallway and followed it up to the deck where he'd seen her earlier. As soon as they stepped out into the cold night air, Ranger heard her crying. He barked and pawed at Patrick's leg. Patrick looked way up at the arm of the crane. "Miriam!" he shouted. He took off his jacket and threw it on the deck. Then he hoisted himself onto the base of the crane and began to climb out its long arm. Patrick's heart pounded. He'd been terrified of heights ever since his father's fall at the shipyard. He'd always found reasons to work on the lower riveting and painting sites instead. But this was different. "Hold on, Miriam, I'm coming," Patrick called. He clung to the cold metal with his knees and reached for the next support. His hands were already numb from the cold, but he kept climbing. The crane's arm wobbled every time Patrick moved. He forced himself not to look down. He kept his eyes on Miriam until finally he reached her and grabbed her icy hand. "My dress," she cried, looking down. Her skirt was caught between two pieces of metal, as if the big machine had taken a bite of it to hold her there. "Hold on tight again, just for a moment." Patrick let go of Miriam's hand. He wrapped his legs and one arm around the metal support and reached down as far as he could stretch. Finally, he felt the rough fabric in his hand. He gathered a handful and tugged, but the crane held on. Patrick took a deep breath. He held the fabric tight and yanked as hard as he could. Finally, the skirt pulled free. "There," Patrick said. "Now let's climb down together." He shimmied backward down the crane arm, stopping every few inches to guide Miriam's boot to the next foothold. When he made it to the base of the crane, he jumped down and reached up with both arms. Miriam leaned into them. He lifted her down onto the deck just as Hamad raced up the stairs with a man from their village. "There you are," Hamad said. He looked as if he couldn't decide whether to hug his sister or throw her overboard. "What were you doing?" Miriam started to cry again. "I wanted to climb up like the boys did," she said. "I wanted to see onto the other deck." Ranger nuzzled Miriam's hand until she knelt to pet him. That quieted her down. Patrick and Ranger walked Hamad and Miriam back to the third-class cabins. It was nearly 11:30, and most of the families had gone to sleep. The music had stopped, and the instruments were all put away. "Thank you," Hamad told Patrick. "Thank him." Patrick nodded down at Ranger and gave him a scratch behind his ear. "He's the one who came to get me." Hamad knelt and gave Ranger a tight hug. Then he stood and said good night to Patrick. "Sleep well." As Patrick and Ranger turned to leave, the floor shuddered under their feet. A terrible scraping, crunching noise rattled the air. A grinding, grating sound like a boat running up on rocks at the beach. Then doors opening and closing, and rushing, thumping footsteps. "What is happening?" Hamad asked Patrick. "Did we bump something?" "I'm not sure," Patrick said, but he had a terrible feeling. He opened the door and looked up and down the hallway. There didn't seem to be any warnings. "I'll go see, but I'm sure it's nothing. Try to get some sleep." There were more footsteps rushing down the hallway above them. Then it was quiet again. Too quiet. The engines had stopped. And that is the end of chapter 6.